We're good at recognizing it in the Psalms. We're great at recognizing it in Bible prophecy. So, why do we not recognize it in Leviticus chapter 23? People who believe the Sabbath is a feast day interpret Leviticus 23 like this. In verse 2, when God says, "These are my feasts," and then he mentions the Sabbath in the very next verse, they think that he's identifying the Sabbath as one type of feast day. Then, when God repeats himself in verse 4 and says, "These are the feasts," and mentions the yearly feasts, they think he's identifying those as another type of feast day. So, in their opinion, there are two types of feast days. But I think something else is going on here. Instead of these verses being about two different days, I think they're just giving more information about the same days. And if this is true, it demolishes the theory that the Sabbath is a feast day. Remember in part 3 when I said that one way you can know that your answer about a topic is correct is if you're following the rules or principles about that topic? Well, Bible students and theologians recognize a principle called repeat and enlarge. Most of us have heard that phrase. It's also called repeat and expand. We use it to interpret the visions of Daniel and Revelation. We see parallelism in the Psalms. It's really surprising that we don't recognize it in Leviticus 23. So, what exactly is repeat and enlarge, and how will it help us solve the feast day problem? In repeat and enlarge, the writer starts off by mentioning a topic. You don't get much information about that topic when it's first mentioned. But then when he mentions the topic again, he gives more details about the topic. These new details shed light on what was unclear when the topic was first mentioned. Now, if repeat and enlarge is going on here, Leviticus 23 is absolutely not calling the Sabbath a feast day. That claim would be debunked. These next two slides will explain exactly why I say this. In our scenario, repeat and enlarge is going to answer the question, where do we look to explain verse 2? Because where you look matters. Let me repeat and enlarge myself. Where do we look to get a definition of the feast days in verse 2? Are we supposed to just read the scriptures in a linear fashion, chronologically, and look to verse 3 to explain verse 2? Or should we be reading the scriptures in a parallel fashion and let the parallel verses explain verse 2? Do we let the repetition and enlargement define the feast days in verse 2? I'm going to repeat myself a lot in this video. Do we wait until God repeats himself, which is his way of letting us know that he's bringing up the same topic again, and let the details that he provides at that time explain verse 2? Where you look to explain the feast days in verse 2 determines your definition of them. So we're at a crossroads here. This is how we're going to solve this problem. I'm going to provide a formal definition of repeat and enlarge so that you know this isn't just coming from me. Then we're going to see if what's going on in Leviticus 23 fits that definition. Since repeat and enlarge only has 3 easy parts to it, this is not going to be hard to figure out. And since I'm only going to read 4 Bible verses in this entire video, this isn't going to take long either. So let's start with the definition. So you can Google this yourself or look it up in a theology textbook. But I just went online and told AI to give me a definition of repeat and enlarge. So let's look at the definition that it gave. It says that repeat and enlarge is a biblical interpretation principle. Let's just stop right there. What does that mean? A biblical interpretation principle. Well, a principle is a rule. In this case, it's a rule or a method for how to interpret the Bible. There's safety in following the rules. If you follow the rules, you end up with the correct interpretation. Now, let me get back to reading this definition from the beginning. Repeat and enlarge is a biblical interpretation principle where a concept, prophecy, or vision is introduced, then later restated with additional details to provide a deeper explanation. Sometimes we just need to be patient and wait for that deeper explanation. That definition then went on to say that repeat and enlarge will have three parts. The first thing it will have is an introduction. I'll read. The process begins when God or a biblical author introduces a foundational truth, prophecy, or historical event in a broad, high level overview. An overview is an introduction. So basically, in order to repeat something, you have to say it first, right? So the first time you mention it counts as the introduction. The second thing you're going to have is a repetition. I'll summarize the slide. It says that the same subject is reintroduced later in the text. And the purpose of this is to refer you to something that you're familiar with now, because we already introduced you to it. And the repetition is to let you know that the topic is highly important. And then the last thing you're going to have is the enlargement. I'll summarize this slide as well. Basically, it's more details. Instead of just saying the exact same thing twice, the repeated account zooms in on specifics. It's going to add new context, meaning, or details that were not mentioned when the subject was first introduced. So now that we know the three parts we're looking for, let's test for our first condition. I'm glad that we can start at the beginning of the chapter because this is where all the controversy is. So, for context, in verse 1, God just tells Moses to teach the children of Israel about his feast days. So, we're going to start with verse 2. Do we have an introduction to a topic that God is going to expand upon later in the chapter? Let's see. Verse 2. Concerning the feast, Moedim, of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts. Do we have an introduction to the feast days here? Yes, we do. This verse doesn't tell us what the feast days are yet, so this qualifies as just a basic introduction. This slide shows the first topic that was introduced, which is the feast days. Let's move on to the next verse. Verse 3. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest and holy convocation. Ye shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. Do we have another introduction? We do. It's introducing a different topic here, the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is the second topic that was introduced. Now we know what topics God plans to talk about in this chapter. Now, what are we supposed to expect after the introduction? The repetition comes next, right? Now that we know our subjects, we should expect God to repeat them somewhere in the chapter. If God mentions these topics again, it's a repetition. All we have to do is move on to the very next verse. Verse 4. These are the feasts, Moedim of the Lord, even holy convocations, which ye shall proclaim in their seasons. What do we see going on here? Does it sound like God just repeated himself? In verse 4, does God repeat verse 2 and mention the feast days again? Yes, he does. Let's actually compare the full text. I think it gets more interesting than just what we see on this slide. These are the two verses that we just read. Does verse 4 look like verse 2? Does it sound like verse 2? The wording in both verses is nearly identical. The subject of both verses is the same. It's the feast days. And the way that God describes the feast days in both verses is also the same. I color coded those two characteristics. They're the same in both verses, but they're just mentioned in reverse order. Verse 4 adds a little more detail by saying that these days would be proclaimed in their seasons. They have to be proclaimed in their seasons. In verse 2 also, even though God doesn't mention this. This is what you need the moon for, to figure out when the month starts. Then you can proclaim to the people when the feast would be held. So verse 4 isn't saying anything that doesn't also apply to verse 2. These are parallel verses. That means that they're talking about the same thing. Parallel verses don't have to say the exact same thing in order to be talking about the exact same thing. The point of parallel verses is to mention the topic again so that you know what God is talking about, and then to add more detail. Now, if these verses are talking about the exact same thing, then they're talking about the exact same days. Since verse 4 is repeating verse 2, I think we can identify that repetition is going on here. As a matter of fact, we have even more repeating going on in this chapter. Look at verse 37. It's about the same topic as verses 2 and 4, which is the feast days. Now look at the characteristics that are color-coded. Verse 37 has the same two characteristics as verse 2 and 4, but with another detail added. Comment below if you can stand before God and tell him that no repeating is going on in this chapter. Let's get back to verse 4 because I want to continue with these verses in order. So we saw our two introductions, and we saw that one of them was repeated. We have the introduction to the feast days in verse 2 and the repetition to the feast days in verse 4. Now, if repeat and enlarge is going on, what's the next thing that we should see happen regarding the feast days? The enlargement comes next. Here is where we should expect God to provide more details about the feast days than he did in the introduction. So, do we have more details about the feast days after verse 4? Do we have an enlargement of verse 4 in this chapter? The entire rest of the chapter is an enlargement of verse 4. Does God not, in verses 5 through 43, provide more details by identifying exactly what the feast days are? The entire rest of the chapter, except for the very last verse, is literally an enlargement of verse 4, which means that it's also an enlargement of verse 2. This slide shows how verse 2 is repeated and enlarged upon in this chapter. Can you see how verse 2 is just the introduction and it expands out to the rest of the chapter, really? There is no denying that repeating and enlarging are going on in this chapter. On this slide, we can see that God also brings up the topic of the Sabbath again in verse 38. It's a very short mention, but he does bring up the topic later in the chapter. So this qualifies as a repetition. When he does repeat the topic, he gives a new detail about the Sabbath that he didn't give in verse 3. He explains the relationship of the Sabbath to the feast days by saying that the Sabbath is beside the feast days. This new detail is an enlargement. The Sabbath isn't the focus of this chapter. We already learned about the Sabbath earlier in the Bible, so God doesn't have to provide a lot of details about it in this chapter. But it is mentioned in this chapter for a reason. I'll cover that in a future video. This is just a visual summary of how both topics repeat and enlarge. So let's put everything together that we learned. I think there are some new ways that we can think about this chapter. I really want to drive some points home, so I will be repeating myself. We can clearly see that there is repeating going on in this chapter. And we can clearly see that enlarging is going on in this chapter, especially about the topic of the feast days. That's enough to verify that repeat and enlarge is going on in this chapter. On that basis alone, we should look for the details given in the repetition and the enlargement to explain the introduction of the feast days in verse 2. Now, if anyone still has doubts and doesn't think that verse 2 is talking about the same days as verse 4, then consider this next point. We learned in part 2 with the deduction exercise that verses 4 and 37 were referring to the same days. We said that verse 4 was the introduction and verse 37 was the conclusion to the annual feast days. But let's look closer at these two verses. There are three characteristics God is using to describe the feast days here. And these verses have only two of the three in common. So 2 out of 3 is 66%. So these two verses that only share 66% of the same content are talking about the exact same days. Now let's look at our two verses in question, verse 2 and verse 4. There are two characteristics that God is using to describe the feast days here in these verses. And these verses have two of the two characteristics in common. 2 out of 2 is 100%. So if these verses share 100% of the same content, Why is it hard to believe that they're talking about the same thing? Why would verses that share 2 out of 2 characteristics not be talking about the same thing? Why wouldn't they be talking about the exact same days? Comment below if you feel confident telling God that these 2 verses are not talking about the same thing. I think it's fair to assume that all of these verses are parallel verses and that they're all talking about the exact same days. Now let's talk about the introductions. We saw that each topic that God introduced at the start of the chapter, he mentioned again later in the chapter. The fact that both of these topics are repeated later in the chapter confirms that verses 2 and 3 are just introductions to these topics. If these verses are just introductions to different topics, then they're independent of each other. They're not defining each other. Again, we need to view these verses as 2 independent introductions. The reason they're mentioned together is because they do have something in common. The Sabbath is in this chapter because it has something in common with the feast days. For more information about that, see my video about category rules. Finally, let's look at the enlargement here. Look at verse 4. If verse 4 is referring to the 7 annual feast days, and verse 4 equals verse 2 because they literally say the same thing, then doesn't this mean that verse 2 is also referring to the 7 annual feast days? I'm going to repeat myself here. If verse 4 expands out to mean the 7 annual feast days, and verse 4 equals verse 2, then doesn't this mean that verse 2 also expands out to mean the 7 annual feast days? If repeat and enlarge is going on here, and God is defining verse 4, then he's also defining verse 2. And more importantly, if verse 4 doesn't include the Sabbath, then verse 2 doesn't either. Remember at the beginning of this video when I said that people view these verses as identifying 2 different types of feast days? I added the white line between the columns to make the distinction between the 2 alleged types. Well, here's a new way that we can view this. Instead of thinking that it's feast day and different feast day, we can now understand that it's feast day and definition of feast day. Again, it's not feast day and different feast day. It's feast day and definition of feast day. So hopefully now we can understand that every time God says, "These are my feasts," he is only ever referring to the 7 annual feast days. That's it. In Leviticus 23, God defined the feast days using the principle of repeat and enlarge. He defined them as being the annual feasts only and not the weekly Sabbath. For lunar Sabbatarians, if God is not calling the Sabbath a feast day in this chapter, there is absolutely nothing in Scripture to connect it to the moon.